To perform a dumbbell deadlift, you are going to assume a normal stance position as you would use for your conventional barbell deadlift. Then you're going to place the dumbbells to the side of your body. Ideally, you're going to want those handles around the mid-foot position, similar to where the barbell would be laying if you're performing a traditional barbell deadlift. Now, once you bend over to pick up the weight, a couple things to keep in mind is that we're going to have a deeper knee and hip flexion. So we're going to assume more of a squat-like positioning at the beginning of this movement. So we're going to think about sinking those hips back and down and then trying to maintain a relatively neutral back. Now do note that with a greater level of hip flexion and torso flexion, we might see a little bit more of a rounding posture in the back. That's totally okay as long as we mitigate how much flexion is going on along with being mindful of our loading. So once we get into our position and we have our dumbbells set up, we have our hips and knees in a position that is conducive to this movement, we're then going to think about bracing, standing up with the weight, locking out at the top, keeping those dumbbells to the side. So we do want to have those lats engaged as we stabilize that weight through the concentric lifting portion of the movement. And then we're going to initiate the eccentric in a similar movement pattern that we used when picking up the weight. So when we start to bend down to lower that weight, we're going to think about having those hips come back, those knees track forward slightly, and then we're going to assume a similar position that we used when we started this movement. If you're doing these for reps, you can tap the dumbbells on the ground and then repeat your reps as so, but I will say be mindful of your positioning of the hips and back when doing sequential reps without taking any form of breaks in between to set up. In my opinion, the dumbbell deadlift performed traditionally can be a little bit awkward. And if you want to kind of limit how awkward it feels and more so replicate a true barbell deadlift and how you're going to execute the setup positioning and the movement, then I would recommend opting for a kettlebell deadlift variation or use some form of lift or plates to elevate the dumbbells to create a more true hip position that replicates something similar that you would have in a barbell deadlift. Thinking that the dumbbell deadlift is the exact same thing as the barbell deadlift. Because we are sinking the hips lower and putting our knees into greater flexion, we're going to have a completely different setup, and how we are initiating the movement is going to be very different than the traditional barbell deadlift. So my advice to you is to think about the differences, so the differences in muscular recruitment of each movement, and then put them into their own categories. If you want to focus on a more posterior focused deadlift with dumbbells, then I would recommend putting them on an elevated surface so you can kind of keep a hip angle that is similar to your barbell deadlift, or opting for kettlebells if you have them available. This will put you in a similar setup to your traditional deadlift and will keep a bit more emphasis on the posterior versus the quads when we're sinking those knees into greater flexion. So when it comes to muscles worked for the dumbbell deadlift, I think it's really important to pay attention to, once again, how we are setting up and how we are executing this movement. When we put the knees into greater flexion and the hips in greater flexion, we are changing some of the musculature that's going to be needed to, one, initiate the movement and then carry out that movement. So in the barbell deadlift, the hips are positioned a bit higher. So that means we're going to have a bit more of the prime mover focus be on the glutes and hamstrings to create that initiation off the floor and to finish that movement to create a strong hip extension. In the dumbbell deadlift, we have greater knee flexion. So that means the quads are going to be more active when initiating the movement. On top of that, when we go into greater hip flexion, the hamstrings are not going to be nearly as active. So our prime movers are going to somewhat shift to the quads and glutes, similar to if we were performing a trap bar deadlift with a low handle position and we had greater hip and knee flexion. On top of this, we have to look at the torso as well. With the greater torso angle that's leaned more forward, we're gonna have a bit more of the back musculature at play to stabilize the weight. The back musculature is, yes, gonna be in play during the barbell deadlift. However, with that greater positioning, we're gonna have to be a lot more cognizant of our stability through that lifting and extending portion with the torso as we perform the dumbbell deadlift. Now, does that mean the hamstrings are going to be completely null in the dumbbell deadlift? No, but when we are initiating the movement and breaking the floor with that greater knee flexion, they're not going to be nearly as much at play as if they were in the barbell deadlift. They'll be more so active as we complete that movement and as we hit true hip extension. So when thinking about the muscles worked in the barbell and dumbbell deadlift, it can be really important to create separate buckets for how you plan to strategically use these in your program based on the musculature you want to target. So a couple benefits that I think come along with the dumbbell deadlift is, number one, you can pretty much perform them anywhere. So if you're working out at home and you don't have a barbell available, the dumbbell deadlift can be a decent sub. The second benefit that I think can come along with this movement is that if you are a beginner and you're not necessarily caring about your barbell strength, or you don't have a barbell, nor do you ever want to train with a barbell, you can use this variation to still train the posterior and some of the aspects that the barbell deadlift normally would. Now, I would recommend that if you're trying to train more of a true barbell deadlift positioning and setup and the musculature involved in that, to elevate those dumbbells or use kettlebells, because it's going to put you in a similar setup to your traditional barbell deadlift. But those are two benefits that I could see coming along with this exercise. It's decent for beginners, it's decent for folks working out at home. If you have a good conceptual and grounded knowledge on how to use this and how to implement it strategically, then it does have a purpose and intent in some programs. And that wraps up this tutorial of the dumbbell deadlift. This is a movement that I think we need to separate from how we think about the deadlift. If we change the fundamental starting positions of the hips and knees, we are somewhat creating a different movement. A true dumbbell deadlift will have you set up in a similar position to more of a low-handled trap bar deadlift. We're gonna have a lot more quad activity due to the greater knee flexion and a lot more glute activity when initiating the movement due to the greater hip flexion. So when strategically using these in your program, try to create separate buckets, or if you want to try to mimic a more true barbell deadlift with a dumbbell deadlift, elevate the dumbbells slightly to put your hips in a similar position as a barbell deadlift, or use kettlebells. Those can be a phenomenal option as well. If you like this video, drop it a like, drop the channel, subscribe. I'll see you guys in the next one.